All right. Welcome, everyone. This is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and this is the May 2020 webinar. It's a dual presentation. Brett Chedzoy and I will be talking about slash walls. And Brett, do you want to give a little welcome hello while I get into the share mode?
Sure. So here in New York, we have a group called the New York Forest Owners Association. And when we had our April meeting via Zoom, it was brought up that we were actually going to do a woods walk out the Cornell's Arnot Forest in early May with Suzanne Tragar from New York Audubon to help us identify some of the birds that we are hearing in these early successional habitat areas that we've created within the slash walls. And of course, the current events put that on hold. So it was suggested in our April meeting of the local chapter of the New York Forest Owners Association that we consider doing something related to our work with regenerating woodlands using slash walls. And this ties in very nicely to the Restore New York Woodlands initiative that was started probably about 8 years ago by the Forest Owners Association. So I in turn bugged Peter about, hey, it's being suggested that we do a meeting on slash walls, and Pete said, well, I just happen to have the perfect opportunity because I don't have a topic yet for my May 20th ForestConnect webinar. So one thing led to another, and here we are today. It seems like such a long time ago that we said May 20th will be the magical date to do this, but seems like there's interest because apparently about 400 of you have registered for this, which might be our largest ForestConnect webinar ever. We'll have to go back to the historical archives. So with that, Peter, take us away.
All right, thank you, Brett. So again, welcome everyone. We're talking about slash walls, and I was just, as I'm launching the slides, I'm looking at this and thinking a restoration strategy should really be just for future woodlands. So the work so far has been focused in New York, but as you will see, we're going to make the argument that this has application beyond New York. And there's been a lot of people and a lot of energy and a lot of resources that have been put into this, and we acknowledge that this is very much a team effort. And so we appreciate all of our interactions, and everybody has been fabulous to work with. A little bit of history or context on the Arnot Forest. The Arnot Forest is a Cornell University research and teaching forest. It's about 4,300 acres. And it's managed as a working landscape. So we have one area that's set aside for long-term research where we don't do management, but the remaining essentially 4,000 acres are accessible. What we're trying to do with this is to demonstrate good forestry practices, and through that we test experimental treatments, whether it's different herbicide treatments or different mechanical treatments or whatever it might be. And we want to see what works and see what doesn't work. We also have to make our budget, and we also have to support the teaching, research, and extension mission of the College of Agriculture and Cornell University. And then we're trying to have a healthy forest with a balanced age structure. So across those 4,000 managed acres, we want to have a range of age classes. And that's kind of where we were in the late 1990s, and we were thinking about how are we going to start doing some regeneration cuts, and we recognized that there were at least 3 things that were important. We had to do good silviculture, and we had been doing good silviculture. Don Schaffler was the forest manager then. We had been doing some really nice examples of intermediate treatments. And we were also thinking, well, we knew that we had some interfering veg problems and some deer impacts, but we were kind of thinking in the late 90s and speculating that maybe if we could get 2 out of 3 of those working in our favor, we'd be okay. And it reminds me of the Meatloaf song, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So it was more of a question, will 2 out of 3 suffice? And we were doing good silviculture and we were doing a lot of vegetation work. We did not necessarily have a good handle on the deer. And so when we started doing some regeneration cuts following the onset of Ernebuck, so you had the Arnot Forest, you had to shoot 2 does before you're eligible or you earn your buck. Started in 1998. 6 years later, we had our first significant regeneration effort. We followed that up with some broadcast herbicide. And then 15 years later, you see what we have, which is largely a mixture of undesirable species. And so we did the silviculture on this, I think, was textbook quality shelter wood cut. It was a beautiful stand, beautiful harvest, very well done. We did a couple different vegetation treatments in here, and the end result was we still got species that we didn't want. We tried that something similar in another area. We put in strip clear cuts that had both residuals as well as adjacent seed sources, and 15 years later we have really good stocking of largely undesirable species. So we were experiencing things. We saw that play out. What was being documented at a broader level, this was some work that was done by the Nature Conservancy. Really great study looking at FIA, forest inventory and analysis plot data, where they found about 43% of the state had very good or good regeneration of canopy species. And so that you see the picture of the map, the red and the orange are where things are not working out so well, and then the different shades of green are good and very good. And keep in mind that a lot of that good and very good is in the Adirondacks, and it's not necessarily just hardwood species, and it's maybe higher elevation areas where they don't have some of the complications that occur elsewhere. But a study nonetheless documenting this. At the same time that they were doing this work, we were doing work based on a human dimension survey where we sent a questionnaire to foresters, and we said basically, when you were in the last location that should have regenerated, so there was a harvest that should have regenerated, what kind of regeneration did you see? And what we found was that there was a 30% success rate. So Nature Conservancy found about a 43%. We had about a 30%. We had different definitions of what success was. They were similar but not identical. But the take-home message from this is that in New York in 2010 and just before 2010, there were 2 independent verifications that there's some kind of a problem that's going on with the regeneration of New York forests. When you have less than 50% success, I think you and many other people think that you should be worried. We also asked the foresters what's causing the problem. And across the board, the biggest problem in the state was deer, followed by interfering vegetation. So most of you are, I think, familiar with what deer can do to hardwood seedlings. This is just this is a encapsulation of the impacts. A deer is an herbivore, and it needs about 7 pounds of fresh weight of forage per day, and that's collected selectively. So deer are going to browse some species more aggressively than they browse other species. That 7 pounds works out, when you break it down, there's about 600 seedlings or seedling tips per pound. So an individual deer every day can impact up to 4,200 seedlings. So that's a lot. And what that looks like numerically, we've done some work where we have fenced and unfenced areas. This is one location in St. Lawrence County. We're using a protocol that we developed that's called AVID, which is assessing the vegetation impacts of deer. And you can see that hop hornbeam, genus Australia, unfenced is going to grow about 4 inches in height per year. And that's the blue bar. If you look at the gray bar, that's sugar maple, fenced. That's also growing 3 to 4 inches per year. So the slope of those two lines is roughly parallel. So those species are growing about the same. Hop hornbeam is not preferentially browsed. That's a low palatability species. Sugar maple is a high palatability species. And you see on the orange bars where you have sugar maple that's not protected by a fence, the average height of those seedlings. And each of these colors represents about 30 species. Tag stems that are remeasured, unprotected sugar maple is declining. So this is a graphical representation. This is what it looks like in picture form. This is in the Western Adirondacks near Old Forge. This was some research area that Dr. Paul Curtis and I put in back in like 2008 or 9. And I was looking at beech control. He was looking at regeneration, and the yellow birch clump that you see on the right-hand side of your screen is a fenced-in area. So when you fence it, you exclude the deer, and take note that there's only 8 deer per square mile. You get a well-groomed collection of yellow birch. In the absence of that, where you have sunlight, you get fern, and in the backdrop, you see what the previous forest looks like. It was mostly beech. So we're not even regrowing beech here, we're regrowing ferns. So this pattern that we saw is not anything new. And if we go back to the early 1980s, this is work out of the US Forest Service in the northwestern Pennsylvania, report by Dave Marquis. And that whole research group has done some phenomenal work on deer and forest vegetation. This was a summary, and it says here, just highlighted in green, in some areas deer browsing has completely prevented the reestablishment of forest trees following cuttings. And he goes on to say that attempts to protect seedlings from deer are either ineffective or prohibitively expensive. The only long-term solution to this resource management is to bring the deer herd into better balance with its habitat. So they're advocating for a reduction in deer population, which is one way to limit deer impacts, is to limit the population size. The other option is to limit the access. But the problem with deer is much older than that, if you will. And this is a study by Curtis and Rushmore. It was published in the Journal of Forestry in the 1950s, going back to work that they had started, that had initiated in the 1930s, in that they see that deer are exerting a strong influence on reproduction cutting. And this is in the Adirondacks. So this is up in Newcomb, New York. And these are areas that you don't typically think of. And if you ask most foresters in New York, where's the lowest deer impact, they're going to say the Adirondacks. And so even more than 70 years ago, there were deer impacts. So deer browse selectively, and they're limiting, as we see here, they're limiting the composition, the species that are occurring, and that is having, I think, a profound and problematic influence on what does occur. So if you take away some species, you see what's left behind. This is some data that's going back to the early 90s that's looking at the dominant species of saplings in the understory. So this is forest inventory and analysis data. And what we can see in 2012, the most abundant species of saplings, so these are stems 1 inches to 5 inches DBH, is American beech. And these are 978 million stems. So that's just shy of 1 billion beech saplings in New York. Between 93 and 2007, there's a 24% increase in beech. And then the next 5 years, 07 to 2012, there's a 14% increase. They're about to publish the next 5 years, which is 2012 to 2017. And I think that we'll see, again, beech maintains predominance in the sapling layer and has a fairly significant increase. The other 4, the other 5, the total, these are the 5 most common saplings. You can see the species that we would be interested in, like red maple and sugar maple, those are on the decline. So this is a troubling sort of projection. So coming back to the Arnot Forest, we had a history of good silviculture. We had a history of Ernebuck where we were very aggressively hunting the landscape for 20 years. We have gone to great lengths to shoot as many deer as we possibly can. We have support by the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation with deer management assistance programs. So we have antlerless, extra antlerless deer tags. We use broadcast herbicides. So we're doing the things that we think we need to do, and where we have excluded deer and small exclosures, we see good success. But in a practical operational scale, we are unsuccessful in our regeneration harvests. And we were thinking about, so Brett's gonna jump in here next, but as a segue to that, we were thinking about how can we manipulate these two things. And this was a study that was done by an undergraduate in the early 2000s, Karen Kamprunth, working with Paul Curtis and Gary Goff. And these are, keep in mind, these are very small plots. These are 10-foot by 10-foot plots. And they had 4 different treatments. So one was a control, nothing happened. Another was a cut only. This was a mature canopy with a beech understory. So the understory was cut, overstory was thinned to about a 70% relative density. There was a third treatment that was just a fence, so there was no cutting, and then a cut plus fence. And what we found, where we cut it and fenced it, we had a pretty good response of desirable species. And so the segue then, literally and figuratively, about 2016, Brett took over as the forest manager at the Arnot, and he was dealing with how do we make budget, how do we create a more balanced age structure, and how do we limit the impacts of deer. So Brett, it's all yours.
It'll help if I unmute myself, correct?
There you go. Perfect.
All right, Peter's going to advance the slides for me. So let's go to the next slide, Peter. And while we're getting there, a few questions have come into the chat box as Peter was talking. I answered some of those questions because it seemed like it was important to know the answers up front. One of the best ones, or most obvious ones, was what's desirable and undesirable. So if you hadn't seen my reply to that, so in our case, we're calling desirables the species that make up the current mature stand. But desirable and undesirable can be based on whatever your own objectives are. Undesirables would be examples of species that really dominate and prohibit the growth of the other species. So in the case of the Arnot Forest, we're talking about beech, hop hornbeam, striped maple, and in some cases invasive shrubs. So, whatever you think is desirable is desirable. What you think is undesirable is undesirable. All right, so, but as more questions pop into your minds, please feel free to chat or type them into the chat box. However, we'll probably wait till the end and discuss those questions as a group now so that you don't have to worry about flipping back and forth to see what's blinking in the chat box. So our longtime forest manager, Don Schaffler, retired in 2015. And by the fall of 2015, I was hired part-time. If I didn't introduce myself yet, I'm a regional extension forester. I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension, Schuyler County. I have worked with Peter closely throughout the almost 15 years now that I've been part of the extension system. And I cover an 11 county swath of the southern tier, coordinating our master forest owner volunteer program. So to me, it was a welcome opportunity to be able to work at least a day a week over at the nearby Arnot Forest. I was a student in the 80s at Cornell, kind of grew up loving the Arnot Forest. I think it's a real treasure to have in our own backyard here in our tiny little county. And so for decades, Don and Peter and others have been doing textbook forestry on the Arnot, but it clearly was limited in the results because we were failing to take into account the impacts of the deer and some of the problematic plants. So when I was tasked with moving the timber management program forward, I started to look around and I was seeing many aging stands on the forest that had been thinned multiple times, again, using good guiding forestry principles, and realized that these stands were near the end of their life cycle and it was time to think about establishing the new young generation of trees. So what Peter and I were familiar with was fencing. We had seen some successful fencing projects in not too far away over in the northern tier of Pennsylvania. And we're like, well, we've tried it. We've tried pretty much everything but fencing on the Arnot. Maybe it's time here to build our first fences. And we had done some small scale fencing projects on the Arnot that seemed to be successful. They were, but in many cases, less than an acre in size. Well, I think in all cases, less than an acre in size. So as we started to look at this first area that we wanted to do a regeneration harvest on, it was about 60 acres, and the terrain was pretty challenging. And what I learned there was that you can probably build a fence around most of it, but it's that rest of it that you have to really worry about. And if you look at this illustration here from Pennsylvania, you can see that the terrain is relatively flat. In many areas where you're going to see these types of deer fences that are at least 8 to 10 feet tall, they typically have good access around the perimeter. That was not the case of where we wanted to do this first regeneration harvest. Next slide, please, Peter. So the other thing is that we try very hard to practice what we preach. And as I mentioned in the introduction, about 8 years ago, the New York Forest Owner Association launched their Restore NY Woodland initiative. And it was to bring attention to these challenges of an aging current forest resource and how we were going to help establish the forest of the future. So we realized that we were going to need to rely heavily on even age forest regeneration methods such as seed tree harvest and shelterwood harvest. And this is a big leap for we have been doing some of these types of harvests in the past at the Arnot Forest, but these are obviously forests that have a pretty dramatic visual impact. And when the Forest Owner Association first began talking about their Restore NY Woodlands initiative, we were quick to remind them that this was going to be forestry to which many private woodland owners were unaccustomed. It was going to be something much more visually impactful than just the go out and let's take out some of the saw timber trees and make it look pretty afterwards. Next slide. So after carefully considering the options for building some sort of a human-made deer fence around these areas where we wanted to protect the young regenerating forest, one day Peter and I were sitting in the office and Peter said, well, what if we just took the slash or the logging debris and pushed it around the perimeter and windrows? We had seen some examples of this where farmland was being cleared and it was all pushed into windrows to later burn and reclaim that land. And we got to thinking about it carefully, and we couldn't quite come up with a reason why it wouldn't work. So we began consulting with some forester friends of ours to see if they had ever seen examples of it. Nobody really had ever seen where this had been done before. We began talking to some logger friends to see if they thought it could be done. They couldn't quite give us a great reason of why it couldn't be done. So we set about, we put the wheels in motion to build these first slash walls in some of these regeneration harvests. And the picture on the left-hand side there, that was the first section of slash wall we ever built. Flip to the next slide, please, Peter. This was part of a harvest, a 74-acre harvest that we call the gas line harvest, because there's a gas line right away that you can see running right through the middle of that. This is on the upper portion of the Arnot Forest, about 18 to 1900 feet in elevation. And this drone image here gives you a great sense of the scale of it and what it looks like from above. When you capturing the slash walls is really tough, I found, from the ground level, especially after they've been in place for a year, because there's just so much vegetation in the way screening the wall. But when you see it from above, you really come to appreciate what this kind of a project looks like. And the size of this wall going into it, we had no set scale in mind that we wanted to do 74 acres. It just became a 74-acre harvest when we began to look at the terrain and the control points on the terrain, that we wanted to tie it in to both geographical boundaries as well as our physical boundaries, such as the forest property. And so this harvest here, we began in March of 2017, and the loggers completed it in about just under 5 months. I think around 4th of July was kind of the official ramp up date. Please flip to the next slide, Pete. There's the invisible forester standing in the foreground of that particular wall to give you a sense for scale. And even though I'll talk about it here in a few minutes, you're probably wondering, those of you especially hearing this information for the first time, well, how tall are these walls? So we required the loggers to build them to a minimum 10 feet high. This wall here, we were kind of flubbing our way through the contractual obligations, and we just said they had to be at least 10 by 10 feet. And then there was a qualitative criterion there as well, saying it had to be sufficiently dense and thick to keep deer out. And if you think about that, that's a pretty subjective situation, but it was something that we felt was important to put in there in addition to the dimensions. Next slide, please. So between 2017 and recently, we set about answering these types of questions. How much does it take to build these walls? Well, I think the first and most basic question is, could we even build a slash wall? But then once we saw that, yes, we could build slash walls, how much does it take to build the wall? How much wood goes into these walls? I think Peter and I never really stopped to think too much about what the value of the wood was going into the wall, but this turned out to be a frequently asked question, especially amongst forester audiences. What are the dimensions of the walls, and not just the minimal contractual measurements that I just mentioned of 10 by 10 feet, but how do these walls change over time? How much slumping is there, and what are these walls? You know, if we say we want a 10 by 10 wall, what do they actually turn out being once they're built? And what is the life expectancy of these walls? Next slide, please. So in 2017, we did 4, actually we did 5 harvests. There's 4 that are shown here. And one of the first things that we learned, and this wasn't surprising at all, is that the amount of time that it took to build a sectional wall varied quite a bit by um, the, the attributes of that area. So terrain seemed to be a big influence. The amount of material seemed to be a big influence, and the shape of the wall seemed to be have a significant influence as well. And if you look at the highest cost slash wall harvest there, 12 acres, what we call the wedge harvest, as the name implies, this was a triangular shaped piece that had essentially 3 acute corners. So those acute corners, it turns out, added quite a bit of time to the wall construction costs. The second most expensive harvest there, the gas line harvest, the one that we just saw the drone image of, what you can't really see in that image is that the back third of that harvest was a deep and very steep cove site where we had to build the wall down and across side slopes that were probably in excess of 40%. And going into that, we had no idea if the loggers would actually be able to even build wall in that terrain. We gave them the option of going in a straight line down through the cove or going around the top and building probably 2 to 3 times more wall. They chose the first option, and turns out they built a pretty good wall across it. Of course, they had fairly good ground conditions when they were doing that too. If we were trying to do it on slippery winter snow or mud, it may not have been possible. But if you take the average of these 2017 harvests, it was roughly, I think with the other Station Road harvest, maybe no, we're not lumping those. Am I off? I'm off by a harvest here, but we had over 100 acres here, and the average cost was just under $1.50 a foot. If we were using a operating cost of $200 an hour for the feller buncher, and the key piece of equipment, it turns out, in building these walls is that feller buncher, because of its ability to not only cut lots of small trees that we want to put in the wall very efficiently, but also pile those trees into the wall. And we'll talk a little bit about the end today about what other equipment could be used to build walls. But the feller buncher, we were fortunate that we started out with a mechanized crew that had one of these feller bunchers, and it turned out to be just the right piece of equipment to build these walls. Next slide, please, Peter. Another thing that we looked at in some of the subsequent harvests in 2018, 2019 was how stand conditions or some of the stand characteristics would change this cost or this this rate of construction. So we took measurements, we surveyed the perimeter of a 140 acre regeneration harvest that we call the North Gate harvest. We classified it into 4 distinct stand types, ranging from relatively small poles to kind of mature mixed hardwoods and hemlock. And this was a bit of a surprise, but the rate at which they could build wall under these quite different stand conditions did not change significantly. And the other thing that we did there was measure. We had our forest technician, Cole Lakes, recording what was going into the wall at different measurement points. And we estimated there that there was, if you look at the wood that might typically go on a truck and be hauled off to market, we simply went with diameters of 6 inches and greater, although I should point out that a lot of the material bigger than 6 inches that goes in the walls are pieces that are probably too crooked or too defective to necessarily go on a log truck. But we using a rate of a couple dollars a ton for that low grade material that we would normally be paid for, and instead are diverting it to the wall, the cost of the wood was only about 75 cents a foot, or $75 per 100 feet. So when you add the cost of the wood to the cost of the labor, the machine time to build the wall, the overall cost was averaging about $2.25 a square foot, which I think Peter will talk about a little bit later on. But compared to the costs of building wall or building fences, that seemed pretty attractive to us. Next slide, please, Peter. And so we also wanted to try to assess how long these walls were going to be functional, and that is how long they would hold up to keep deer out. Our early goal was to keep deer out for 10 years, or a minimum of 10 years. We felt that if we were doing the appropriate silviculture and dealing with the interfering understory at the time of harvest, that we could get a new young stand up above browsing height in 10 years. And as all of you tuning in today, I'm sure realize, in some cases it may only take a few years, and in some cases it may take well over 10 years. It really depends a lot on, of course, not only where you are and what species you're dealing with, but what the starting conditions are. So this graph here is simply to point out that yes, slash walls do slump over time, and we've seen about a 25% decrease in the initial height over the first few years. The rate of slumping, though, seems to slow up considerably after about the second year, and that makes sense if you think about piling a bunch of big fluffy material and then the weight of that pushing down over time. The other thing that we looked at, of course, is if the width of it changed, and now we realize that the width is probably as or more important than the height in terms of keeping deer out, because it's kind of like the cattle guard principle of where deer don't want to step over this material that their feet or legs are going to fall down through. As one wildlife biologist told us, a deer would look at that and say it's not worth the broken leg and becoming dinner for the coyotes. The type of material that's going into the wall also seems to influence, though, that rate of slumping. And where we build a wall entirely out of red pine, the rate of slumping was a little slower in the first year, but a little higher in the second year. Next slide, please, Peter. So I want to close out my portion here by sharing with you some of the learning curve to date, and we could take any one of these points and talk about for the rest of the afternoon. Terrain, as I said earlier, does have an influence on not just can you build the wall or not, but what the cost of building that wall is going to be. We've learned to use terrain to our advantage. Our most recent harvest at the Arnot Forest was where we had some steep ridges, and we tried to build the wall just over the crest of those ridges so that as deer walking upslope, approaching the wall, they would look at that and think of it as a more formidable obstacle to cross. The material, and what I mean by material is the amount of wood you have that's suitable for putting into the wall. To date, we have not used any of our high quality saw timber. Obviously, to build walls, we're putting the valueless and nearly valueless type trees and portions of harvested trees into the wall. But the more wood you have close to where you want to build the wall, the better. When the machines have to start carting wood over from say much more than 50 to 100 feet away, I think the cost goes up exponentially. Size does matter, and so does the shape. I already pointed out the downside to having acute angles in your wall, but we are now looking at the cost per acre. So it's no surprise that the smaller the wall, that's to say the fewer number of acres, you're taking a relatively high cost to build the wall, and if you're dividing it by fewer acres, you have a higher ratio of wall per acre, so you have a higher cost per acre of enclosing it with a wall. And I'm not ready to say yet, what's the minimum threshold. We have built several small 1-acre walls, and I don't believe we have processed the data from doing that yet, but the what we're finding is the contractors building these walls are becoming so proficient at that they can build these walls quickly. And I think that we'll see over time what the figures were early on, like in 2017, 2018. The contractors are getting better and better, and consequently the costs are going down. So the cost per foot of wall is going down, and with that the cost per acre can go down over time too. Spelled out in the contract. If it's not in there, you can't enforce it. So as I said at the beginning, we have both a dimension and a qualitative criteria, and that's determined by the forester in charge, myself. And then think about all these other things that also have to happen in order for the slash wall to be successful. So if you just go in and build a wall, but you don't deal with the interfering understory, will you get regeneration? Who's going to build the gates? If you really don't have the capacity to do that, can the loggers do it, or do you need to contract it out to somebody else? And the bigger harvests, you're almost inevitably going to have some deer trapped inside. We have dealt with that on the harvest to date using deer damage permits to go in and forcefully remove those deer. And then if it turns out that there are some weak points in the wall, who's going to go back after the fact and fix it? And it may be 6 months or a year down the road before you really find what those weak points. We found that it's very useful to go in and walk the perimeter after the first tracking snow of the season, because if there's deer in there, you'll not only see those tracks, but you can find out where the deer are going to escape if they are in fact trying to escape. So with that, let's switch back to Peter, and then we'll leave some time at the end for discussion.
Thank you, Brett. Very well done. So to carry on with this kind of framework of research questions, Brett talked about the abiotic questions, specifically what are the characteristics of the wall. And now what I want to talk about is the biological side of things. So we wanted to know two basic questions. One, and there are sub-variants of these, but the first basic question is, do the walls work at excluding the deer? And this was our overwhelming first question. Was, as Brett had pointed out, we've seen that fences work. The thing that scared us with fences was not so much the initial cost, but was the maintenance cost. And we didn't, if we could get past the terrain issues that Brett had mentioned, who's going to maintain those walls? And we didn't have the staff to do that. So that was a major driving force to look for an alternative, which ended up being slash walls. So the first question when we were starting these walls was, can they exclude deer? And that was really what we were focused on. The second thing is, what are the patterns that we see in vegetation? How does vegetation, desirable species, I apologize for not defining those are for us the commercial timber species, as well as native understory herbaceous plants. How do these desirable species respond? What are their growth patterns and abundance patterns in the absence of deer? This was not something that we had any experience with. And so we had different kind of breakout of questions, such as particularly beech is a problematic species for us. We wanted to know, could we avoid the expense of using herbicides if we would have the loggers use their hot saw on their feller buncher to brush out the understory. We're interested in the spread of invasive plant species, and then what species, tree species, dominated early on and which survived. So regarding the first question, do slash walls work? We can say with pretty good confidence at this point, yes, we're into our fourth growing season, and we have 4 lines of evidence, all of which are consistent um, in showing that the walls are effective at excluding deer. We have, and I'm going to show data for the first 2. The second 2 are more observational, but yet are in full concurrence. So the first of these is AVID. Again, this is a field protocol that we use where we tag seedlings and then we monitor the growth of those tag seedlings through time. The protocol has us wait 1 year after a disturbance before we go in and tag species. And that shows here for sugar maple in this gas line harvest. Uh, uh, we started working with seedlings in 2018. You'll remember that this harvest was completed in 2017. So just in that first year, toward this 2017 growing season, seedlings inside the wall were protected. They ended up with an average height that was greater than the seedlings on the outside. So on the inside the wall, the heights were 11 inches and 10 inches, fenced and unfenced, and outside the wall they were 4.5 and 5.5 inches. We then go back every year, usually in August, and remeasure the heights of those seedlings. And there was a relative growth rate of about 33% on the inside, whether it was fenced or unfenced. And so that's the difference between the first year and the second year divided by the first year. So if you look at the inside the wall unfenced, 13.4 inches minus 10.1 is 3.3, divided by 10 is a 33% increase. At the other end of the spectrum, outside the wall, unfenced, there's a 5% relative growth rate. So we did this for all of the species that we have tagged. Rather than taking you through a whole bunch of graphs, I'll just summarize them in this one chart. You can see that for the 3 most palatable species, sugar maple, red oak, and red maple, the walls are having a dramatic impact on the growth. And this is of seedlings that are only about 10 inches tall, and in the first growing season or the second growing season of response of increased sunlight. There are 2 species, sweet birch and chestnut oak, that essentially it didn't matter whether they were inside or outside the wall. So this may be it may be an attribute of their palatability. It may be an attribute of their growth rate. It may be that there are other dynamics going on that we have yet to identify. We also have some seedling height, just some general seedling height growth that I'll show you in relation to this second objective. So the second objective is about the vegetation patterns in the absence of deer. And it's interesting to think about. There's been a huge amount of very cool forestry science that's been done in the eastern and northeastern United States in the last 30 or 40 years. And when we think about the impacts that we have seen deer have in our area in the southern tier of New York just in the last 20 years, we look at some of the research that I cited earlier from the U.S. Forest Service research team, starting with Dave Marquis and then Susan Stout and now others. You know, very good scientists documenting the impacts of deer, and a lot of this forestry science that we've seen has been in the presence of deer. And so now we're looking in the absence of deer, what can we expect? We received funding last October to go at this in a very significant way. And so we're essentially using a modified version of Silva plots at a density of slightly less than an acre per plot. We're stratifying them interior plots versus perimeter plots to see if the activity of building the wall influences the vegetation in response. We're looking at seedling height increments, overstory vegetation, residual basal area, and then plot conditions. There are several things we're focusing on, and we've partnered up with Dr. Jeff Ward and others who are in the process of trying to get some slash walls built in Connecticut and Massachusetts. And so this is going to be a very exciting parallel study to work on, and we've developed these methodologies in concert with them. You can see that we're looking at the response of sprouts versus seedlings. Obviously, the sprouts are going to grow faster. Which species dominate early, which species emerge later, whether there's an interfering vegetation response to brushing. It's was conceivable based on, if you remember, those 10-foot by 10-foot little research plots that we had established in the early 2000s, that we might be able to have more economical and mechanical control of interfering vegetation, and then kind of standard silvicultural things looking at residual basal area and shading and seedling growth. So looking first, we have some preliminary data. So this is hot off the press. I haven't even entered all the data, so it's preliminary. It's a subset. The next time we give this talk, these numbers will absolutely change. So don't commit these to memory, but just show some general patterns. So this is seedling sprouts or stump sprouts. I shouldn't have the word seedling, or stump sprout height growth. And the first collection of bars there of colors, we see beech, sugar maple, and white ash. And we can see that the total heights of these stems that are of stump origin, some of them are over 70 inches tall at this point, and the sugar maple and the white ash are taller than the beech. If we look at the height increment, so this is the inches of growth in 2019 season and 2018 season, we can see the pattern by species. We see that white ash is going to grow well in both of those years. Sugar maple did pretty well in 2018, not as well in 2019. And the height growth of beech from stump sprouts appears to be increasing, or at least they had a better year in 2019 than 2018. We can then also look at seedlings, stems that were of seedling or unknown origin. So these were stems that were single stems. There was no stump obvious, and so we're categorizing them essentially as an unknown origin. We see the total heights here. We're at 50 inches, and this is after 3 growing seasons. So this is pretty exciting. If usually we're trying to get seedlings to at least 60 inches in height to make them free of deer browsing, then we're only 10 inches away. And you can see that all the species are doing about the same, although sugar maple, at least in this subset of data, is not doing as well as the other species. Basswood and white ash grow very well. Many of the basswood, I think, are from probably of some kind of a sprout origin. We see beech again doing well. Red oak does well, and sugar maple and white ash. So the beauty of this, our concern was that beech as a stump sprouter or as a sprout origin species is going to overwhelm the other species. So just in the basics of the height growth of those individual stems, that doesn't appear to be happening. And having spent time out there putting in research plots, there is not a proliferation of beech. There's a pretty good understory of beech in this area, the gas line harvest, before the cutting took place. And so the question was whether or not we're going to get a whole bunch of root suckers and stump sprouts back, and that doesn't seem to be happening. So what we can conclude so far, first of all, is, and I'll give you some conclusions and then some recommendations, and then we'll look at the questions in the chat windows. First conclusion is that slash walls exclude deer. And this is really 2 pieces. First is the conclusion that you can make slash walls. There's a way to get this done. All of the things that Brett talked about in terms of the shape and the size and working with contractors that are invested in the process is all crucial to having a slash wall that will exclude deer. We've had slash walls in place for 4 years now, and they seem to be fairly stable, but slumping, of course, a little bit every year. Advanced regeneration, so some of those stems that we were measuring that are currently 50 inches tall were present as advanced regeneration, and it's no surprise when deer don't browse them, they grow really well. We're expecting to see some interesting patterns of vegetation in the absence of deer. The picture is showing one of the 4 harvests that was completed in 2017 has areas that is dominated, has a canopy of elderberry, which I have never seen. It's pretty remarkable. And then the final is that it does seem that beech sprouts are not going to be taking over the way they had. So it's and whether it's because we're giving them lots of sunlight or because we're not selectively browsing the other species remains to be seen. So what are our recommendations if you're going to undertake a slash wall? How do you set the stage for success? First of all, if you can work in an area where you already have some advanced regeneration established, that's good. If you need to have a slash wall, that advanced regen is probably browsed. We're going to come back to this and trying to think about sequencing and timing of silvicultural operations. So we'll talk about more in the following slide. You need to have abundant low grade at the perimeter of your harvest, or you need to shift that perimeter to an area where there is abundant low grade. One of our challenges was with a history of thinning, there were some areas where we just didn't feel like we had enough low grade available to be able to build the wall. So Brett would adjust the perimeter of the harvest to a location where there was low grade to work with. We've worked with an awesome logging crew, and they were very much invested in the outcome. They're want to make sure that the forests that they're working in are sustained and regenerated for the future. You have to have some way to control interfering vegetation, as we've talked about already. The loggers for a fee that worked with us, and they brushed the understory. You need to verify the wall. The loggers were attentive to what they were doing, but there was, I think, in almost all cases, there was, spots here and there that you'd look at it and you'd say, I don't think this is quite what we want it to be. And then you have to design and install effective gates. On that, gates, and more generally, Brett and I are in the process of developing a bulletin, a workbook on best practices for slash walls, and we'll go into the design and construction of gates. There's still more that we need to learn about. One thing that we're very interested in is kind of uneven age silvicultural systems. And the picture that you see is a 1 acre circular experimental patch cut. These were done to see primarily if there is enough wood inside 1 acre to build a slash wall. And you can build a slash wall. You can't build a 10-foot by 10-foot or a 10-foot by 20-foot as it works out to be slash wall. This slash wall was more along the lines of about 6 to 8 feet on average, I think. We're going to be measuring those this summer. This was done last year. But a 6-foot wall on a 1 acre opening may be sufficient. A 6-foot wall on a 120 acre opening is probably not sufficient. We need to think through how we can do multiple entries if we're trying to both establish advanced regeneration at the first entry in the presence of high deer pressure. How do we keep, if we can keep the walls operational ideally for 10 years, maybe for 8, maybe for 12, but what we need is 12 to 15 years to establish advanced regen and then release it. How are we going to work with that in keeping the wall intact? In our area, there's always streams, and sometimes it just makes more sense to go over the stream with the wall, or to abut the wall up to the edges of the stream, and then put some kind of a gate or fence over and through the stream. So we're trying to figure out how to do that without complicating or collecting debris that might be floating down the stream from getting into the wall. These are relatively small streams. They're not classified trout streams, just to be clear on that. And then finally, we want to be able to calibrate the standing volume prior to harvest to the ability to construct the wall. So if you can go in, what's the sampling methodology for a forester to go in, cruise the perimeter of a wall and say, this is going to work. So slash walls aren't for everybody, and they're not for every situation. We're obviously talking about regeneration harvest. This is not something that you would be thinking about with an intermediate harvest. And I've seen areas where there are generally low deer populations, and they have high mortality rates because of winter kill and the ownership parcels are such that they can do very large and iterative, adjacent, even age harvests, and effectively they can overwhelm the deer. So in a case like that, maybe slash walls aren't necessary. It may be that you have situations where you have effective population controls. We have not been able to do that with really aggressive hunting pressure. We have not been able to limit the population, the deer population, to a low enough level that we can regrow the forest. It may be that you have a budget where you can install, inspect, maintain, and remove fencing. And if you do, great. It may be that you have a desire, a management objective where you want to preserve and you don't want to do any cutting. Well, you can't have a slash wall without cutting some trees. So with that, here's our contact information. I'll leave this up for just a minute. I want to call your attention to a new resource page that we've created, the slashwal.info page. We will be posting this presentation as a PDF there. We'll post a link to the recorded version of this webinar on that page. You can go see we have an informational, educational video posted on that page. So please check that out. You have our contact information. We'd love to hear from you. If you're thinking about doing a slash wall and you want to talk with us, we would be delighted to talk with you by phone. If we can get to you in person and visit the site, that would be a lot of fun. Our goal is to, because we believe that this is a very viable solution to a very real problem, we want to see how this can work in other areas with a variety of different logging crews on different forest types. And we stand ready to help and support you in that. So let me stop sharing, and Brett and I, we have lots of questions I see. Brett and I can go through the questions and respond to those.
Yep. Given the number of questions, I think what we'll do is we'll give the really quick answer to the question, and then for as long as those of you that want to hang around, we can keep kind of chatting about more of the detail of some of these questions. Two questions that that did catch my attention, though, that I think we can answer quite quickly is it was asked what is brushing the understory. That's a term that Peter's using to refer to where we're having the loggers with the hot saw on the feller buncher cut all of the understory vegetation. And when we say all of the understory vegetation, we mean like literally all of the understory vegetation. So everything down to almost seedling size, at least sapling size, because what we want to do is remove all of that low shade that would interfere with seedlings from becoming established and growing. The other question was, it was asked, why is beech considered undesirable? Beech is, we love beech. We just don't like badly diseased beech, and most of the beech at the Arnot Forest is heavily affected by beech bark disease. However, we have been finding some spectacular large individual trees scattered throughout the seas of dead and dying beech that seem to be completely asymptomatic to beech bark disease. And we are leaving those trees. That's another story for another time, but we've been working with some plant geneticists from the Boyce Thompson Institute on the Cornell campus to map the genome of those healthy beech, and our long-term goal is to propagate offspring from those healthy beech and help restore healthy beech to the landscape.
So Brett, I've scrolled back to where we started questions at about 12:12. I don't. Can you see the timestamp on the questions?
Yep, I'm getting there myself here.
Right.
Yep.
So I like your strategy. We'll give a very kind of quick response to these. What we can also do is Brett and I can type up a more thorough response in a kind of question answer format and post that to the slashwal.info page.
Yeah.
So Richard Carbonetti, and I'll, Brett, you want me to read the questions, and then how do you want to handle this? Brett and I didn't discuss how we're going to handle questions. We
Sure.
discussed everything else.
Just make sure and I like your idea, Pete, that we can, if you can capture these questions, then we
Yeah.
can,
Yeah.
because all of these would actually be great posts for the new Slash Wal website. So just make sure you somehow cut and paste these.
Okay, so
Uh,
I'll read the question. Brett, you give a quick response, and then I'll just keep my mouth shut unless there's something really urgent that I think needs to be added. So, given the number, these are going to be terse responses. Don't take offense. So Richard Carbonetti says he's from Maine, and he says basically moose are an issue. More so, I mean, they have an impact greater than deer. So how about, he didn't ask this, but he's implying, what do we think about moose and slash walls?
I don't see why slash walls wouldn't work equally as well for moose.
Okay.
We don't have moose at the Arnot Forest. I used to work for Scott Paper Company up in Maine, so I kind of know what moose do in the woods. But the it, there was a question further down too about other wildlife that's utilizing these areas today. So we've been setting up game cameras. They're kind of a heavy duty type game camera at the entrances to all these slash walls. And we've seen essentially every type of animal that lives on the Arnot Forest moving freely in and out of the slash walls, except for deer. So that's pretty neat when you think about it, because we're only really discriminating against the hooved ungulates. And I think if we were building like 10-foot high woven fence, we would be excluding additional species of wildlife, for better or for worse. But probably things like coyote and bear would struggle to get over those tall woven wire fences, whereas with the slash walls, they seem to be able to tunnel under or climb over, whereas the deer, these walls are too tall for the deer to leap over, and they're too thick for the deer to tunnel their way through.
Brett and I also hosted some foresters from Pennsylvania a few months ago, and they have elk in their area. And I know that elk are different than moose, but they seem to think that the slash walls would be effective against elk. Next question, what about birth control for deer? Why didn't we try that at the Arnot?
That was a question I answered earlier. If, Paul Curtis, I don't believe it's on the webinar this morning, but Paul is one of Peter's colleagues at Department of Natural Resources. In fact, he's one of our co-investigators in this current slash wall project. And Paul would tell you that they've been there, done that, tried it, extremely expensive. And my recollections of Paul's discussion on this was pretty ineffective too, because you only have to miss a handful of deer for it to, but the cost for sterilizing deer in some of the suburban areas around the Cornell campus was in the thousands of dollars per deer.
Yeah, and the birth control option maybe wouldn't be as expensive, but it's impractical in a forested setting. They were in an urban setting.
Yeah, Gary Goff is tuned in here, so maybe Gary has some of those figures in mind. If so, Gary, feel free to type them into the chat box. But it's not going to work. That's the terse answer.
That's the short answer. Okay, so the AVID manual is almost revised, and that will be posted to aviddeer.com hopefully within a few weeks. Gary Willis wants to know if we have markets for whole tree chips. Terse answer.
Yep, in our area, no. So
and there's more that we can say about that we will when we write this up. Dennis wants to know if the slash walls are fire hazards.
could be.
What's that?
Could be. where we are, the answer is no. In other parts of the country, or even in portions of New York State, yeah, they could catch fire.
So here it says, talked about the cost per square foot. Did you mean lineal foot? And so that's, I'm assuming that's the $1.50 a foot, which, yes, correct, that is a per linear
Yeah,
foot.
if I said square foot, that was my mistake. Yes, per linear foot.
Peter Woodbury wants to know, since the widths ended up being over 20 feet, is that what we are now recommending?
Yes, we are. So not only so to achieve the minimum height of 10 feet, and it's now 10 feet to a 3-inch minimum diameter. So not one little tiny twig sticking up in the air, but really to something that's likely to persist for at least a few years. It just so happens that to achieve that height, the base is about twice as wide, and we haven't really seen any of our how many miles of slash wall do we have at this point, Peter? Have you
Like
calculated it?
like 50,000 feet.
Yeah, so quite a few miles of slash wall. We haven't really seen any variation in that width of the base. So we're now requiring a wall that is 10 feet high and 20 feet wide. And I mentioned this earlier that the width is really, as these walls slump over time, it's probably that width that's going to really help continue to deter the deer.
Okay. Rob wants to know if we have slash laws in New York as they do in Maine.
So by slash laws, I would assume that's like what we have in the fire counties and portions of northern New York, where you have to lop tops to a certain
Diameter.
diameter
Right. You have to
to,
delimb the stem down to a 3-inch stem, delimb the stem to 3 inches. Yeah, just delimb the stem down to 3 inches. So I don't know what the slash laws are in Maine. And we don't have slash laws in play at the Arnot Forest. So that would be, I mean, that's certainly, if there's a law about it, then you'd have to take that into consideration.
yeah. So the other way of looking at that would be the visual impacts. And I could see where, since forest practices are often regulated at the local level in New York, I could see where some municipalities may have a local ordinance that requires some type of top lopping, or that would restrict the ability to build a slash wall just because of the visual impact. So this is all part of the education process, though. And I think over time we have to realize that this may be the best, if not only, option to successfully regenerate young stands in throughout much of the Northeast, and consequently, we're going to have to look at any restrictions on building slash walls and address those, and um, work with the elected officials and municipal officials to um, either get a variance or to modify those ordinances.
Okay. So Aki from Michigan, hi Aki, wants to know if the red pine is efficient. Is red pine as efficient to build a slash wall with as compared to hardwoods?
It's neat. When we did the 13-acre red pine slash wall harvest, they it was a different design. So Peter likes to call it the low and wide model, where we, and again, we'll just stick to the real basic stuff now, but we built the wall was lower but wider, and that enabled the loggers to efficiently harvest the red pine. They essentially laid the bunches down with all the tops oriented in a row to create the slash wall, and then they used the hot saw to tip off the red pine. So they left a little bit of red pine pulpwood behind the woods, which today would be cause for celebration because we recently lost our pine pulp market in this area. And um, those walls, even though at ground level, again, you'd look at them and say, that's not much of a wall. Peter and I tried to actually climb through that wall, and I think we got about 5 feet into it and got terribly stuck and decided that, yep, that's going to work. And that is a wall where we've it's a little bit more of a remote harvest, so we don't get to eyeball as frequently as the other ones. But today we have yet to see a single deer footprint inside that harvest, so it must be working.
Okay, Dave Jackson. Hi, Dave. Wants to know if the cost of maintaining and removing fences has been taken into consideration with any of your calculations. So let's assume that he means costs for maintaining and removing. I don't know if he means walls or fences.
I believe
So
walls here,
what's
because
that?
we're not building fences. Well, we did
Right,
build a 33-acre fence.
right. But so we talked about the costs of fences. So I'll respond to that. So from a wall perspective, we don't do any maintenance and we don't do any inspection. We do an initial inspection, and then we've never gone back to any of these and looked at them again. Although we are visiting them as part of research, but we're not as you would with a fence. We have, as Brett mentioned, one area that we have fence that we check about every week or 2 weeks. We're not going to be removing the walls. The walls will stay in place. I don't have good numbers. Actually, Dave, I would call you and say, hey, Dave, how much does it cost to remove a fence? Um, and but that's something that we were conscious of when we were thinking about fencing versus some alternative to fencing.
And what we're really looking for once the slash walls are built are initially, and as Peter said, while you still have the crew and the equipment there, you want to do an initial inspection to see if there's any spots that need to be shored up. And once it's all complete and done though, and you chase the deer out or forcefully evict them, then what you're really looking at that point is just for the presence of deer inside. And in the 10 larger slash walls that we've built over the past few years, we've only had one situation where we had deer get in after the fact. It was a doe and a fawn. Correct me if I'm wrong, Peter. And when we went in there to get rid of the doe and fawn, we found their little escape hatch, and turned out in that section of wall there was a giant hemlock that had been laid in the wall and kind of propped up with the large limbs. And once the needles fell off the hemlock, there was just enough daylight for the deer to tunnel under there. So we found their tracks going through that spot, patched it, and that was a year and a half ago, and no deer have been seen in there since.
All right, Walter wants to know, where do you acquire so like multi-question here, where do you acquire the wood for the slash wall? Is it from the woods that you're trying to enclose? And if so, what percentage of the woods do you have to cut down to build the wall?
Well, the percentage is going to change based on the number of acres inside the wall or the scale of the wall. Typically, they're utilizing the low-grade trees, that's to say the pole-sized trees and the tops of the larger saw timber trees, from probably on average about 75 feet, from up to about 75 feet from where the wall is being built.
From the inside of the wall.
From the inside of the wall. So we're saying roughly a chain is where most of your material is going to come from. And that can be as little as probably 30 to 50 feet, and it can be as much as 100 to maybe even up to 150 feet where the material is pretty sparse.
Okay. Jack wants to know, does the logging company build the wall, or is it a separate contractor? And are they built typically as the logging continues or after the logging has been completed?
Those are great questions, Jack. Yes, so this is all one big integrated operation. It's the same logging crew that's cutting the timber, that is executing the regeneration harvest, that is building the wall. And that's one of those little important contractual points that I failed to mention, is that you would want to work this into your contract in a way that building the wall is done at least concurrently with the harvest. You don't want a situation where the crew comes in, cuts all the timber, and disappears overnight and your wall remains to be built. We are paying our contractors a rate per foot of wall built now. That rate is $1.50 a foot in our current contracts, and we are also paying them for cutting all the interfering vegetation. And that rate can range from $0 to $100 per acre, depending on the density and other characteristics associated with that interfering vegetation. Where it's bamboo thick, 20-foot high beech brush, 100% of the understory, it's going to be closer to that $100 an acre. And those are based on our time motion studies to date. It's a rate that the contractors feel comfortable with. And in our early harvest, we just tried to work that into the values that were being paid for the timber. But over time, as we gained better numbers, we realized that, let's call it what it is. And if it really costs on average so much to build a foot of wall, let's pay them that rate to build a foot of wall and stop diluting the timber price.
Okay. Tim wants to know, how do you remove the wall and when?
The beauty of the wall is you build it and leave it, and it rots down over time and probably provides habitat for the critters for decades.
Okay. Rob asked about pricing information, which you just gave. John wants to know if we have emerald ash borer, and so yes, we do, which is really disappointing because we've got really good ash regrowth. John wants to know, do we have metrics for past and current hunter effort in terms of days per acre? If that's available, we already know it was not enough to prevent overbrowsing. Can you estimate what the level of hunter effort would need to be to prevent overbrowsing by deer? I'll respond to that. So that's a super good question. We do have metrics. Gary Goff, a colleague, retired, I'll say a few years ago, maybe more than a few, managed the Ernebuck program. And so we had an incredible data set when Gary was here of hunter effort in terms of numbers of hunters per day, number of hours per hunter, number of deer that they saw, number of deer that they harvested, things like that. I don't have any of those summary metrics committed to memory, so I can't respond. But we felt like we had some of the most aggressively hunted land that we could find, based on, not numerically, but just based on our experiences and conversations with other hunters, that, somebody has 100 acres and they go out and they hunt it. We were hunting it, significantly more aggressively than they were. One of the differences that we had was, with 4,000 acres, there's a lot of in holdings. I mean, there's all one ownership, but there's a lot of little pockets and areas where deer can escape that you just can't push them out of. So Steve says snow lobe probably affects slumping of the walls, which I would agree with.
Yeah, especially probably in that first year or two where you see most of that breakdown of the fine material that's sticking up in the air.
Rob wants to know about the season of cutting for regeneration harvests.
Whenever we can get the loggers there.
Okay.
Yeah. However, that will be an interesting variable to look at over time. Is, are we seeing a different dynamic in the young stand based on when the harvest was done? And if most of our harvests to date have been quite large harvests, so they've been done throughout a number of seasons. There's some that we started in the spring and we finished the following spring. So I think season, though, probably what's even more important than season is just timing it with perhaps a seed crop. We were fortunate in that we had good seed crops most of the time while we were doing these regeneration harvests, but I hypothesize that most of our future stand will come from seedlings that were already on the ground prior to the harvest.
Mark wants to know if there were invasive plants in these areas prior to harvest, and if so, does it appear that the lack of deer will allow native species to outcompete or to compete with the invasives?
Fortunately, yeah, go ahead, Pete.
So there were invasive plants, not excessive numbers, and in the time I've spent in the last few weeks crawling around in these 4-year-old cuts, there are very few established invasive shrubs, and none of them appear to be um, expanding rapidly. Now, what they look like in 10 years remains to be seen. They're still young and they haven't really become reproductive. So it could be that they're spreading, but there's an intense amount of competition inside these harvesting areas where there are no deer.
It's also important to point out that prior to the harvest, there was intense competition in the understory because of the well-established beech brush understories, and in some cases, striped maple and hop hornbeam. But I think even though any open areas on the Arnot have an abundance of invasive shrubs, in these particular mature stands where we did the harvest, these were stands that had been thinned multiple times. Inadvertently, we would build up advanced understories of shade tolerant, low palatability species like the beech brush. And I don't think the honeysuckle and multiflora rose and buckthorn and barberry and all the other nice invasives that we have at the Arnot stood a chance, because at the ground level it was just complete shade.
Dave wants to know if there were any herbicide treatments done prior to the harvest to control beech or other interfering plants. The answer is no. And that was partly by design, Dave. We wanted to see if we could do a mechanical control in the absence of deer and limit the abundance of beech. So Tim says, here's a thought for the future if widespread adoption takes place, to monitor deer populations outside the walls, learn where the deer go, understand issues with human wildlife conflict, and if they're going to be then moving on to landscape and garden plants because the woods are excluded.
It's a good point. At the landscape level, if so, we've had a number of groups come and tour the slash walls to date, and from some of the high lookout points, you stand in it, say a 75-acre slash wall or a 100-acre slash wall, but you look around at 100,000 acres of mature intact forest all around it. So I don't think that by walling up 100 acres here and there, we're really diverting that deer population significantly. In a more suburban area, could you be shifting them onto ornamentals? I think that problem's already happening, whether or not you exclude deer from a woodlot or not.
Yeah, I think if you need to build a slash wall, then the landscape plants are already being eaten. Now they would probably be eaten more aggressively as you take up a bigger chunk of, or remove a bigger chunk of land from those deer. Just to add to this, a slightly different variant on the question, we have two adjacent harvests. We have the original, that first harvest, what we call the gas line harvest, was 74 acres. East of that and sharing a common wall is what we call the North Gate harvest. The northern border of those two slash walls is a mile of slash wall. So the deer that used to go north and south to slash wall, the northern borders runs east and west. The deer that used to go north and south across that area now are traveling long distances to go someplace else. So there are going to be, I don't know if migration is the right word, but movement changes in the deer. Um, so Greg wants to know if these slides will be available for download. Yes, we'll post it as a PDF at slashwal.info. Okay.
Boria asked a question about sycamore.
Oh,
Yeah,
I missed that.
I,
Sorry.
I like, so the question was, would sycamore be considered desirable? Interestingly enough, even though sycamore is a native tree in our area, I don't think we have a single sycamore tree growing on the 4,300 acres of the Arnot Forest, just because it's almost all upland sites, and our maple experts were looking for sycamores on the Arnot last year to do some sycamore syrup research, and we had to look beyond the borders of the Arnot. So I love sycamore though.
Yeah, I would call it a desirable. I apologize. I saw that question and got distracted from it. All right. Mike Seeger, hi Mike, wants to know if we've looked at the regeneration variation throughout the area inside the slash wall, and if the machine activity near the perimeter gives a different regeneration pattern than the interior. The answer is yes. We've stratified our sample design so that we're going to be looking and able to compare interior versus perimeter regeneration. All right, Lenny Farley. Hi, Lenny. Lenny was my dendrology TA at Purdue. Hi, Lenny. He's now extension forester in Indiana. Wants to know about the potential for USDA cost share assistance for this practice. We hope so.
How brave do you feel?
Short answer is we hope so. We hope so. We've been working with NRCS and also in New York State with the DEC to encourage their deliberate consideration of slash walls as an alternative to allow for the regeneration of trees. So how's that for terse? Probably sufficient. All right, Walt says, Brett, I remember, oh, he just says he remembers you. Nice presentation.
Hopefully in a good way, Walt.
He does. He did. He said, great job. Yeah. Jessica says, when would you recommend a slash wall over a traditional exclosure fence?
So you have to make sure there's enough material there. And I briefly mentioned that we build a 33-acre fence, not a slash wall, but a fence. So in 2018, we did a regeneration harvest in one of the older portions of the Arnot Forest sugar bush. That sugar bush had been thinned over the years, leaving pretty much nothing but large maple trees. So, but it was a very accessible area. We had roads and trails around essentially the entire perimeter. We looked at what was available to build a wall and decided that there was almost nothing there that would build a functional wall. So we built it's about an 8-foot high mesh fence, and we reinforced that fence by having an offset electrified strand. So the electrified strand serves as a psychological barrier, and the mesh serves as a physical barrier. And based on that experience of the last couple of years, I would say that if we have to resort to that again in the future, we're probably going to look really hard for more low-grade material to build a slash wall. It's the fence is, I think it would be fair to say the fence is working, but it's much higher maintenance than any of the slash walls have been to date.
So I'll jump ahead to Jenny Whiteman. Hi, Jenny. Wants to know what's the cost of the traditional fence?
The traditional fence in that particular project, Peter, you got the facts and figures, but it was roughly twice the cost of building a slash wall.
Twice the cost for the install. It was about $4 a foot, linear foot for the install. And then we have a person that spends probably an hour once a week walking the perimeter. For the first 52 weeks, there were 50 times that they had to fix the fence when they walked it because a branch dropped on it or something happened. So that, bumps it up to about a 4-hour per week effort. So there's this maintenance, inspection and maintenance cost that is absent from the slash walls. And then at some point we have to take it down. Well, you don't have to, but then you're left with an eyesore if you don't take it down. Okay, Brendan wants to know if there are studies in regards to the predicted increase in small mammals due to the slash walls. There should be. How about
There
that?
should be.
There
Yeah.
should be. Our focus, Brendan, is like, can we regrow another forest of diverse, valuable species? But there's a whole host of related questions that would be really exciting and interesting to answer. Kayla wants to know if we think slash walls would be relevant for private landowners with harvests that are less than 40 acres.
Sure.
Okay, right. And we have harvests that are 6, let me see if I can rattle them off, 6, 11, 13, 8, 15, and 25 acres. So
those are the small ones.
Those are the small ones, right? But so she says less than 40 acres.
Yep.
The hitch there is the variable is, do you have enough volume and value in the harvest to offset the cost of building the wall?
Yep.
Peter Woodbury says, have you built any slash walls across existing deer trails? And do you see what will cross what they will cross in terms of width and height? So kind of an experimental design. No.
We've probably,
so we've built walls across trails. We've not manipulated that variable of width and height to see what the threshold is for deer.
Yeah, and that's on the to-do list, I think, where we need to scale down our walls to find out what sort of the minimum thresholds are. But in these early stages, we want to err on the side of caution and make sure that we were building walls that were going to work. Because once you build the wall and the contractors leave, it's kind of hard to go back and beef the wall up after the fact. And so we know that 10-foot high walls work now. And we recently built a wall that we built those small walls, the 1 acre walls that, as Peter said, were probably about 6 feet high. And on our most recent harvest, we built a wall that probably averages more around like 8 feet high. But that's the one that I mentioned we built over the crest of a slope. So time will tell if that works, and we believe it will. But much is going to come down to, how motivated those deer are to get inside the wall, because the wall is a physical barrier. In other words, even if the deer really, really, really want to get inside, you want the wall built in a way that they can't get over or through the wall.
I think it's also, I'll say, a psychological barrier. That may not be the right word, but deer can't see through the wall. So if they're standing at a fence, they can look through the fence. And I don't know what goes on in the mind of a deer when it looks through a fence, but you and I look through a fence and we say, oh, there's seedlings on the other side that I wish I could eat. When the deer is standing outside the slash wall, unless it has some memory of where it had been, they cannot see. Maybe they can smell, but they cannot see what's on the other side of the slash wall. All right.
That's a good point.
So Brian asks about continuing egg credits. Those, you already did those when you registered. Trevor says, have you found if the slash walls provide any wildlife or bird habitat?
Well, our other technician, Mike Ashdown, who's also our master gate builder at this point, he's in charge of all the surveillance cameras, and he likes to load up our inboxes on a weekly basis with lots of entertaining pictures of turkeys and woodchucks and every creature imaginable seeming to enjoy the slash walls. To what extent they actually use it as their homes, we haven't had a chance to look at that. We'd love to get our wildlife experts more involved, because these are essentially linear brush piles, and for years we've heard about the importance of brush piles in creating cover and habitat for wildlife. So this seems like a win-win situation for the birds and other mammals.
Okay, Patrick wants to know if we have the rough cost for traditional fencing for comparison. So we talked about that a little bit. When we built the fence, it was, we calculated it assuming that we're paying somebody $25 an hour. It cost about $4 per linear foot to install it. There are efficiencies of scale that you might get to. And so you might drop that down a little bit. These are all installation costs. If you put in a woven wire fence instead of a mesh fence, so this is a plastic mesh that we used, a woven wire fence is going to be more expensive. But they're all, everything that we've seen is just the installation cost alone is greater than the absolute cost. For the slash walls, there's two costs. There's the cost of the machine time and the operator, and that we've calculated and used to be $1.50 per linear foot. The $2.25 is if the landowner says, I'm giving up volume of wood, what does that cost me? So then the landowner would pay the logger $1.50 a foot and would lose 75 cents a foot in theory for the cost of the wood. So the 75 cents there, and there are foresters and loggers that say, well, that's I'm losing that 75 cents is my money. And my response is no, that wood belongs to the landowner until the landowner contracts to sell it to you. So the landowners, just like the landowner owns the dirt that's used to build a skid trail, that's not lost cost for the logger. So this is wood that belongs to the landowner that the landowner allocates into the slash wall. So anyway, that's more than a terse response.
Yeah. If you put a fair market value on all of the potentially merchantable material that we've put in those 50,000 linear feet of slash wall to date, it's been an opportunity cost to us, the Arnot Forest. That's probably, my guess would be, well below $10,000. So, in other words, much less than what we would have spent to buy fencing materials. But we're only getting paid typically $2 a ton for that low grade material, and that seems to be a pretty average ballpark figure anywhere in the Northeast.
Okay, a couple more. Amy wants to know how we are sure that the deer are gone when the wall is finished. So how do we know?
That's another great question. So it's pretty easy to tell if you have deer trapped inside the wall. And this was something that we never even really thought about until we were well underway of completing our first big wall. And that was like, we just, I think, simplistically thought we were going to go in there and clamp our hands and shoo the deer out. And Paul Curtis, our wildlife biologist, laughed at us. And and then it was like,
it was polite about it, but
he was polite about it. And it's like, well, okay, well, we'll just go in there with everybody and pots and pans and firecrackers and chase them all out. And then Paul laughed at us again. And so we realized that we were just going to have to do our best to try and chase the deer out, but that when it came right down to slamming the gate shut, it was likely we would have some deer trapped inside. And I think that first 75-acre harvest, we actually had 3 or 4 deer trapped inside. So I don't think we've mentioned it up to this point today, but the mechanized crew that have built these walls for us is a Amish crew and they were more than willing to assist with that final phase of deer removal. So when we got the deer damage permits, they were happy to go in there and track those deer down and make sure that they were no longer inside the wall. You can use your imagination to piece together the rest of that. But seeing if you have deer inside is, in my opinion, quite easy. You don't need sophisticated surveillance equipment to do it or sit out there for hours looking for deer. Just go out there and walk your freshly graded skid roads soon after the harvest is closed up, and if there's deer in there, you're going to see the fresh tracks in that soft soil.
Two points to add to that. One is we try to make sure that we have the gates closed up before fawning season, whatever that's called. So like this time of year, the does are dropping fawns. What you don't want is a doe on the inside of the wall dropping a fawn, because it's really difficult to separate a doe from her fawn. So you've got to deal with two deer then instead of one. You can't, in terms of, especially if you want to keep them alive for some reason. The other thing is, and Brett, I was reading some of these questions, maybe you said this, we have trail cameras and we put them on the fences. So every wall has at least one, often two or three mesh fences, so that we can gain access in and out of the slash wall.
Gates, not fences.
Gates, right, yeah. A gate, it's a gate, but it's made of mesh fencing. And if you put a trail camera there, the deer that are inside will invariably show up and trip the camera, and then you'll know, after a few weeks whether or not there are or are not deer in that.
And I'd like to add to that so we've been building these gates on the cheap with plastic mesh, and I initially believed that we were going to have a number of cases where those flimsy mesh gates were breached by angry mama deer that wanted to go back and find their babies, or black bear, or some other critter. And I think in the 3.5 years now that we've had some of these walls closed up and these mesh gates, I don't believe we've had a single case yet where one of those gates has been compromised. I think one got a little bit damaged, and the game camera seemed to suggest it was some buck that came up and got his antlers kind of mixed up in the mesh. But because it's working for us doesn't mean it's going to necessarily work for somebody else. And you have to think about what's the risk if the gate does fail, because if the gate goes down and it might be a month or more before you realize that the gate got knocked out by a black bear, and you have a whole bunch of deer back inside, if it's a big harvest and it's now head high blackberries, who's going to go in and get those deer out of there?
Adam wants to know if we have any thoughts on a smaller wall, so the dimensions of the wall are less than the 10 by 20, as a way to deter deer and somewhat reduce their access.
And I think what Adam's suggesting there is, if you can just limit the access enough, could you still get adequate regeneration?
So I'll respond to that. This group of the Forest Service did some really cool research years ago, and they had deer enclosures. So they had deer at, I want to say 10, 20, 30, and 40 deer per square mile rates. And at a low, there's actually some advantage to having a low impact of deer, like in the 10 deer per square mile, where you have good growing conditions, because some of your species that can gain dominance, like pin cherry, are held in check a little bit. And yet at that low of a level, assuming that there's abundant regeneration, they don't negatively influence the development of the forest. But that was done in a research context where they could deliberately control the numbers of those deer. So what's the alternative suggested here, where you have a less robust wall, if that allowed one deer to get in, that would allow multiple deer to get in, and you wouldn't be able to really control and regulate that. So I think the principle works, but the application of it would be a little harder to pull off. Okay, Walt says if we've seen any like first sightings of wildlife, and I'm not aware that we've seen anything new and unusual. Other than we're creating some early successional habitat that's relatively uncommon in this area. So Rob says that he thinks that the lost income in wood in terms of chips, et cetera, would be sufficiently offset by an increase in regeneration because we've eliminated the deer browsing.
Going back to Walt's comment, so on the fauna side, we haven't seen any, we haven't seen Bigfoot out there yet, or whatever whatever previously believed to not exist locally extinct animal, or bird. We have noticed some plants though growing inside the slash walls that we've never really seen anywhere else on the Arnot Forest before, and we'd love to take a closer look at that. The one that Peter and I both had to educate ourselves on a couple of years ago because it was such an interesting looking plant was the American spikenard. I think that's Aurelia is the genus.
Yep. So Dave, as a point of contrast, said he had 2 deer inside a 10-acre fence. He said that doesn't sound bad, but that works out to be 164 deer per square mile.
Oops.
So, all right, I'm going to stop